The term Vedic religions refers to religious beliefs that are all in some way based upon four Aryan texts. These texts were written in Sanskrit before 1000 BC, but are based on oral traditions much earlier. The texts are called Vedas, and they include epic battles between spiritual beings, explanations of how the world was created, and stories about the meaning of existence. The core concepts from these stories appear in the Rig Veda, a particular Veda which depicts the creation of the universe. To summarize, all life is composed of Brahman, the universal spiritual essence. Brahman is incarnated or cloaked in a person's flesh at birth and reverts back to its free state at a person's death. The concept is that this portion of Brahman is the soul, and the argument is that human beings' essences are eternal. The early Aryans were polytheist and worshipped many gods, mentioned in the Vedas like Indra, Vishnu, and Shiva. However, by around 1000 BC, spiritual teachers had begun to see the gods as aspects of Brahman. Their views ranged from the ideas that the gods were linked to specific existence characteristics such as the weather or special groves, to the idea that there was really only one god with many different faces. These oral speculations and teachings were gradually accumulated into a text called the Upanishads. All of these teachings shared the idea that the Vedas held hidden symbolic truths about human existence, which they saw as a cycle called samsara. Samsara, or the cycle of incarnation and reincarnation, was governed by three concepts. Varna, which literally means color or position or class. Dharma, which was a duty based upon your position in society, i.e. your Varna. And karma, the spiritual measure of how well a person performed their duty or dharma throughout their life. If a person's karma was positive, then after death a soul would find a new incarnation with a greater, more demanding Varna, which would in turn have a higher dharma or duty. Ultimately, souls could find themselves reaching perfection and leave this cycle altogether, entering into a state or some considered a location called moksha. Moksha was a fluid concept that could be a hallowed afterlife in heaven or a oneness with Brahman, joining the spirit force. Eventually, this understanding became less linked to social varna and more linked to morality and spiritual growth, developing into what would be Hinduism today. Yet this was not an immediate development. For many centuries, the concepts of samsara competed with temple worship of polytheistic gods and a strict social dominance of Aryans and the upper class over their conquered peoples. During the 6th century BC, these samsara concepts split into three main understandings, the first being Hinduism. Yet there were two popular and influential alternative teachings that both competed with and influenced Hindu thought. The first of these was developed by Vardhamana Mahavira and is called Jainism. Vardhamana believed that people could achieve spiritual perfection in a single lifetime if they cast off fleshly concerns. He and his followers stripped naked, refused any possessions, and existed on cast-off or donated food. They also abstained from sex. Practices such as these that try to subjugate the body in order to attain spiritual growth are called asceticism. There are ascetics in all of the main world religions. Vardhamana's asceticism was dedicated and extreme. He eventually received the name Jain, which is conqueror. His followers, the Jains, won a reputation for dedication to holiness, and while this demanding religion was never widely embraced, their moralism impacted the society in ideas of spirituality throughout all of India. One particular impact was the concept of ahimsa, or absolute nonviolence, to the extent of vegetarianism and the avoidance of killing insects. Buddhism is the second offshoot from the idea of samsara. An educated Aryan noble, Siddhartha Gautama, became dissatisfied with the ritualized polytheism of the Aryan elites, and he was troubled at the extremely different standards of living in his society. The poor and sick lived lives of abject misery. In response to this, Siddhartha briefly attempted asceticism, but ultimately found it incomplete. There are competing versions of what happened next, but at some point Siddhartha reached a state that he called enlightenment, where he felt he understood the meaning of human existence. At this point, he began traveling throughout northern India, teaching and gathering disciples. His teaching was based on 4 suppositions that he called the 4 noble truths. 1, that life is full of suffering. Joy and excitement are fleeting releases that humans spend their lives trying to attain for momentary moments of pleasure. Life is full of suffering because of desire. Desire of momentary pleasure and physical gain drives people, even though it is prone to fail, thus causing pain. There is a path to enlightenment and perfection, which Buddha called nirvana. This path is from the beginning and may take one or several lifetimes in a system very similar to samsara. This path is called the Eightfold Path and can be followed intentionally if one proceeds through the steps. Siddhartha's students began to call him the Buddha, or Enlightened One, and the rest of his teaching was generally about how one could progress down the Eightfold Path. Almost everything we know about Buddha's teaching comes from the later writings of his students, and they interpreted his views in different ways. Buddha says very little about the role of gods in his core teaching, and modern Buddhists, particularly Western ones, tend to view his teachings as a philosophy as much as a religion. However, most of Buddha's original students were polytheists of one kind or another, and incorporated gods, reincarnation, and spiritual morality into their faith. Ahimsa was incorporated from Jainism, for instance. Buddha himself was worshipped as a divine being only a few generations after his death. All 3 Vedic faiths, Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, increasingly defined a person's spiritual duty or dharma in terms of morality, devotion, and social responsibility instead of class, race, or status. However, it was, and in some cases still is, generally accepted that one's position in the world was to some extent influenced by the soul's karma from a past life. In other words, you deserve where you are now. A major development in how people expressed Vedic religions took place around the middle of the 4th century AD. Due to the expansion of Alexander the Great in 326 to 328, Aryan domination in northern India collapsed. In the resulting chaos, people looked for new ways to serve the gods, and a new dynasty, the Mauryan, assumed control of northern India. The greatest ruler of the Mauryans was a man called Ashoka, and in his wars for expansion, he was responsible for an enormous amount of death. This was not unusual for conquerors in the ancient world, but by Ashoka's day, prevailing ideas of holiness in India included the concept of non-violence and non-harm. Ashoka publicly converted to Buddhism out of guilt for the deaths that he had caused, and he sponsored the spread of monasteries. Monasteries are communities where people practiced asceticism and prayer, often on behalf of other people. This shift in Buddhism and Hinduism to the idea that a family member or a representative of the community, a monk, could perform a religious duty on behalf of others meant that these moralizing and demanding faiths were far more accessible to regular people who were entangled in making a living, operating a bakery or a smithy. It also meant that supporting monks financially could be seen as a spiritual effort itself and an expression of one's dharma or duty. Buddhist and Hindu monasteries appeared throughout northern India, the Himalayas, and even across into China, making observance of Vedic faith available to many mainstream citizens.